Do you think the Vatican is all about prayers and piety? But what if it's truly about power? Absolute power, relentless power, power for which people were burned at the stake, wars were waged, and the salvation of souls was traded like goods in a marketplace. How did a mere handful of priests in a city reduced to rubble manage to subjugate an entire continent? What truly lies hidden within its secret archives, and why, even today, are they afraid to fully unveil them? And why are the most infamous scandals, from papal orgies and bloody purges to mysterious deaths and shadowy ties to the mafia, just the tip of the iceberg? Today, we won't merely recount history for you. We're going to crack the code to the world's most secretive and influential organization. You'll witness how faith becomes a weapon, how money transforms into power, and how the holiest of ideals can spawn the most terrifying monsters. Prepare yourself. What you're about to discover will forever alter your perception of history, religion, and the very nature of power. Watch until the very end, and you'll grasp why the Vatican's true secrets are far more terrifying than any conspiracy theory. Most of us take the Vatican's authority for granted, viewing it as a spiritual power rooted in the mists of antiquity, tracing back to St. Peter himself. But here's a paradoxical truth that shatters this conventional understanding. For nearly 7 centuries, the papacy's political might, its right to crown and depose kings, to possess vast territories, and to dictate its will across all of Europe, rested not on the Bible, but on a document that proved to be one of the most colossal and successful forgeries in human history. We're talking about the so-called Donation of Constantine, a charter purportedly drawn up in the 4th century by the Roman Emperor Constantine the Great, in which he allegedly transferred supreme authority over the entire Western Roman Empire to the Pope and his successors. For hundreds of years, this document served as the pontiff's ultimate trump card, irrefutable proof of their claim to an earthly kingdom. It wasn't until the 15th century that it was conclusively proven to be a fabrication, concocted in the papal chancery centuries later. This fact isn't just a curious historical footnote. It's the key to understanding the Vatican's entire dualistic nature. It reveals that from its very inception, the history of the Holy See has been not merely one of faith, but also one of power. A power that, to solidify its grip, did not shy away from deploying the most sophisticated and cynical earthly instruments. This narrative is populated not only by saints and martyrs, but also by brilliant strategists, ruthless schemers, and masterful forgers. At the core of the papacy's colossal edifice of power lies not just the stone upon which the Church was reputedly founded, but also a foundation cemented by all too human ambition, deceit, and an insatiable hunger for total control. Realizing this changes everything, transforming a benevolent image of spiritual leadership into a gripping political thriller spanning 2 millennia. And what truly astonishes me here isn't merely the fact of the forgery itself, but its colossal scale and audaciousness. This was no fleeting ruse for a paltry profit. It was a strategic project designed to span centuries, an intellectual subversion that profoundly reshaped the course of European history. To craft such a document, embed it into the legal framework, and compel the world's most powerful monarchs to believe in its authenticity and bend the knee. This demanded not simply cynicism, but a genius for political intrigue, amplified by a profound grasp of the psychology of power. It reveals that within the Vatican's walls, minds were at work that thought not in terms of years, but centuries, their ambitions stretching far beyond the salvation of souls. They were building an empire destined to outlast all others. Therefore, this won't be a mere catalogue of the Vatican's sins and scandals, nor just another collection of conspiracy theories about secret societies and Templar treasures. No, this will be something entirely different. This is an intellectual investigation, an attempt to dissect the very DNA of power, to understand its inner workings through the lens of the world's longest-standing and most influential organizations. We will endeavor to understand how the idea of universal forgiveness and love, preached by a humble wanderer from Galilee, could mutate, transforming into the ideological fuel for a ruthless political machine that for centuries shaped the destinies of nations, unleashed wars, amassed untold wealth, and sent anyone who dared to question its claim to truth to the pyre. We'll delve into the darkest corners of this history to comprehend not only what transpired, but why and how it became possible. We'll observe how spiritual authority morphed into political capital, how the dogmas of faith became weapons, and how confession became a tool of total control. We'll dissect how this colossal corporation operated, a corporation whose assets were human souls and whose primary currency was the fear of eternal damnation. This is a story of how ideals clash with reality and almost always succumb to it, and how the most noble intentions can pave a road not only to heaven, but also to a very real hell on earth. I invite you to become not just a spectator, but an active participant in this intellectual investigation. Together, we will peel back the layers of official history, like archaeologists unearthing the hidden foundations of an ancient temple. We will analyze documents, cross-reference facts, and strive to comprehend the logic that underpinned the most monumental and, at times, the most chilling events in church history. This is a journey into the very heart of power, into its hidden engine room, where for centuries the history of an entire civilization was crafted and rewritten. To grasp how this tiny, persecuted sect could burgeon into a global powerhouse, we must achieve something almost impossible: to reconstruct not merely the events but the very sensations and aromas of that world. Let's close our eyes for a moment and transport ourselves to Rome in the 1st century. This isn't the majestic, sterile ruins we see today. It's a teeming, chaotic, and deafening metropolis. The air here is thick and heavy, a swirling blend of pungent smoke from thousands of cooking fires, the spicy scent of incense from pagan temples, the sharp tang of garlic and cheap wine from countless taverns, and the nauseating stench of sewage flowing down the streets into the Cloaca Maxima. The ears are relentlessly assailed by the screech of iron wheels on cobblestones, the guttural cries of merchants from across the Mediterranean, the roar of the crowd echoing from the Colosseum's stands, and the incessant murmur of voices in dozens of languages and dialects. It's a world of stone, smoke, sweat, and screams, a world where human life held a very cheap price tag. Now, let's dive deeper beneath the ground into the world of the early Christians. Here, in the labyrinthine catacombs, an entirely different atmosphere reigns. The air is cold and damp, smelling of damp earth, limestone, soot from oil lamps, and the faint, sweet scent of decay emanating from the bodies of deceased brethren interred within the walls. The sounds of the outer world do not penetrate here. Instead, there's a ringing silence, broken only by the measured dripping of water, whispers of prayers in Greek and Aramaic, and the soft, almost spectral singing of psalms. The contrast between these two worlds, the deafening, vibrant, brutal world on the surface, and the quiet, shadowy, hope-filled world beneath the ground, this is the very key to understanding that era. Christians literally lived at the nexus of two realities, and this defined their entire worldview. To comprehend the logic of their resistance, we must grasp two crucial codes that were etched into the consciousness of people of that time. The first code is Roman, the concept of pietas. For us today, this word is associated with piety, but for a Roman, it signified something far greater. It was a sacred triad of duty, to the gods, to the state, and to the family. Offering sacrifice to the emperor's genius was not so much a religious act as a demonstration of civic loyalty, much like upholding the Constitution is for us today. A Christian's refusal to cast a pinch of incense on the altar was perceived by Roman authorities not as dissent, but as high treason, as a renunciation of the very essence of Roman identity. To them, Christians were not merely adherents of a peculiar cult. They were dangerous anarchists, dismantling the foundations of society. The second code is Christian, and it was utterly revolutionary. This is the concept of martyria, which translates from the Greek as testimony. For Christians, death in the arena was not defeat, but the highest form of sermon. Public execution, intended by the authorities as an act of intimidation, transformed into a magnificent spectacle of faith. A martyr, calmly walking toward the lions by their example, testified to the reality of an afterlife and the truth of their faith far more convincingly than hundreds of preachers. This completely inverted Roman logic. The more they were executed, the faster their numbers grew, because each execution became the most effective publicity campaign. Death ceased to be an end. It became an instrument of growth. This clash of worldviews shaped everything. For the Romans, official cults were religio, the proper, orderly, and socially beneficial worship of the gods. Everything else, especially the strange Eastern cults, which included Christianity in their view, was superstitio, a dark, irrational, and socially perilous superstition. The Romans simply couldn't fathom how one could worship a crucified criminal, reject all other gods, including the deified emperor, and yet claim to possess the ultimate truth. In their eyes, this was sheer madness, undermining a world order that had stood for centuries. And this is where we arrive at the most precise and perhaps unexpected analogy. The early church's project wasn't a state within a state. It was, if you will, history's most successful underground open-source social network. Its source code, the Gospels, was freely copied and passed from hand to hand. Its servers, house churches in the homes of affluent parishioners, were completely decentralized, and the destruction of one server in no way impacted the network's overall operation. Its user interface was exceedingly simple and universally understandable: faith, repentance, and love for one's neighbor. And its primary viral technology, as we've already realized, was martyrdom, which ensured an exponential growth of its user base. This system was perfectly adapted for survival and growth in a hostile environment, and the vast bureaucratic Roman Empire, with all its military might, simply didn't know how to combat such a fluid and elusive structure. The turning point that triggered a chain of irreversible changes was not a triumph, but a paradox. In the early 4th century, after nearly 3 centuries of persecution, Christianity suddenly achieved a resounding victory. Emperor Constantine legalized the new faith, and yesterday's underground sect rapidly transformed into a privileged and fashionable religion. But this victory spawned a colossal problem, a genuine crisis of growth. Thousands of new converts flooded into the church, bringing not only donations, but also their customs, disputes, and ambitions. The decentralized guerrilla structure, ideal for survival, proved utterly unprepared for governance. The church plunged into a chaos of doctrinal disputes and power struggles among bishops. A new, centralizing idea was needed, one capable of binding together this unraveling structure. It was at this precise moment that Rome unearthed from its theological arsenal an idea that would become a true engine of history: the concept of apostolic succession and the primacy of the See of St. Peter. This idea was not merely bold, it was revolutionary and even audacious for its era. The Bishop of Rome was declared not just one among several patriarchs, on par with the bishops of Alexandria, Antioch, or the future Constantinople. He was proclaimed the direct and sole successor of the Apostle Peter, that very rock upon which Christ had promised to build his church. This meant that supreme authority, the right to be the ultimate arbiter and final authority in all disputes, belonged to him, and him alone. This was a claim not to spiritual leadership, but to an absolute monarchy within the church. This landed like a bombshell. The reaction from other major Christian centers was entirely predictable, ranging from cool skepticism to outright hostility. The East, in particular, took this especially hard. To them, Rome was merely the old capital, a glorious but fading city. The empire's new capital, New Rome, was Constantinople, and its patriarch, leveraging imperial backing, saw himself as the preeminent figure in the Christian world. Alexandria boasted its ancient theological school, while Antioch prided itself on being the place where Christ's followers were first called Christians. None of them intended to willingly submit to the ambitious Roman bishop. Thus began a fierce, centuries-long struggle, a true Game of Thrones, fought not with steel, but with scriptural citations, church councils, and masterful political intrigues. To transform this theological declaration into a tangible instrument of power, Rome began to act systematically. Popes, such as Damasus I in the late 4th century, were among the first to deliberately construct an administrative apparatus modeled on imperial bureaucracy. The papal chancery began dispatching so-called decretals, letters and edicts that carried the force of law, to all provinces. Latin, the language of law and administration, was established as the sole language of the Western Church, while the Vulgate, Damasus's commissioned Latin translation of the Bible, became the canonical text for 1,000 years to come. Rome was morphing from a spiritual symbol into an administrative hub, the very headquarters of a colossal multinational corporation. Picture a bishop somewhere in distant Gaul or Spain. Before, if he found himself in a dispute with a local duke or another bishop, he was utterly alone with his predicament. Now, a new and powerful resource had emerged for him. He could appeal to Rome, he could pen a complaint, and within a few months receive a sealed reply from the vicar of St. Peter, threatening his adversary with excommunication. Thus, step by painstaking step, decretal by decretal, Rome wove an invisible yet incredibly robust web of legal and administrative power across Europe, centralizing all pivotal decisions. Rome's persistent assertion of its primacy constantly irked Constantinople. The conflict was further exacerbated by cultural divides. The practical, legally minded Latin West found itself increasingly unable to comprehend the sophisticated, philosophically speculative Greek East. Each side viewed itself as the sole guardian of the true faith, deeming the other lost and steeped in heresy. This schism between the two halves of the Christian world deepened steadily until, several centuries later, it transformed into the unbridgeable chasm of the Great Schism of 1054. Thus, the grand idea of papal supremacy was born. It was not a divine revelation handed down fully formed. Rather, it was painstakingly wrested from bitter struggle, meticulously built by the genius of Roman administrators, and ultimately paid for with the unity of Christendom. The initial dream of a unified church under one shepherd morphed into the stark reality of division and centuries-long antagonism. Yet for Western Europe, this concept became the very bedrock that enabled it to survive the collapse of the Roman Empire and the chaos of the Dark Ages, preserving the remnants of ancient civilization under the protective mantle of the papal throne. So, how did this all work? How did a mere handful of clerics in a ruined city on the fringes of the civilized world manage to subjugate fierce barbarian kings and construct an empire that outlasted them all? The answer lies not in miracles, but in the brilliant engineering of power. Following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century, Europe plunged into chaos. Roads fell into disrepair, trade ground to a halt, and a unified legal framework vanished. The continent splintered into a patchwork quilt of warring tribal kingdoms. And into this power vacuum, the Church offered something truly unique. It did not set out to build a new empire of stone and steel. Instead, it constructed an empire of a different kind, becoming the central nervous system for Europe's paralyzed body. Let's peer under the hood of this intricate mechanism. Its central brain, its very processor, was, of course, Rome, the papal curia. From here, like neural impulses, decrees, papal bulls, and decretals radiated across the entire continent. The neurons of this network were the bishops and abbots in every province, even the most remote. These were not merely spiritual shepherds. In a world gripped by widespread illiteracy, they stood as the sole administrators, legal minds, diplomats, and custodians of knowledge. They sat on royal councils, managed vast landholdings, and administered justice. And the synapses, the connecting links through which signals were transmitted, was canon law, a universal legal code that regulated everything from baptism and marriage to property inheritance and the rules of warfare. Let's visualize this process with a concrete example. Step 1. A conflict arises. Let's say a powerful Frankish king decides to seize lands from an influential monastery. The abbot of the monastery doesn't muster an army. He has none. Instead, he dispatches a messenger to Rome with a complaint and, crucially, a generous donation for the needs of the Holy See. Step 2. Data processing at the center. The papal chancellery reviews the case. Has this king become too powerful, disregarding Rome? Has the monastery, by contrast, always been a loyal ally and paid its tithes diligently? A decision is made. Step 3. A command is issued. A papal legate, a special envoy with extraordinary powers, departs from Rome. He brings no legions, but only a parchment scroll bearing the papal seal. And now comes step 4, execution on site. The legate appears at the royal court and reads aloud a papal bull, declaring the king a sacrilegious transgressor and his actions illegal. The king laughs in his face. It is then that the legate deploys the ultimate weapon. He pronounces an interdict, the excommunication of an entire country from church sacraments. And that's when the laughter stops. Overnight, churches across the kingdom close their doors. Priests refuse to baptize newborns, solemnize marriages, or perform funeral rites for the deceased. For medieval people whose lives were permeated by the dread of infernal torment, this was an unmitigated disaster. Their children died unbaptized, condemned to eternal suffering. Their marriages were deemed invalid. Their souls, after death, could find no rest. Panic erupts. Peasants grumble, barons plot rebellion. And within a few weeks, the humiliated king himself journeys to the legate, begging for forgiveness, returning the monastery's lands, and paying an immense compensation. Power had been asserted without a single shot fired. The primary instrument of this system was not the sword, but the word, bolstered by the most potent human emotion, fear. Personal excommunication, or anathema, was a death sentence for a monarch. It automatically absolved all his vassals from their oaths of fealty. Any neighboring ruler received official papal blessing to invade and seize his lands. An excommunicated king became an outcast, whom any subject could betray and slay without sin. This was the highest form of psychological warfare, transforming even the most powerful ruler into a defenseless target. Parallel to its legal and psychological authority, the Church also constructed a colossal economic empire. The tithe, a 10% tax on all income, which everyone from peasant to duke was obligated to pay, ensured a constant flow of funds to Rome. Fees for church rites, the sale of indulgences, donations and revenues from the gigantic landholdings owned by monasteries across Europe made the Papal See the largest financial center and landowner of the Middle Ages. Money granted independence from secular rulers and the ability to finance any political project, from the Crusades to the support of loyal monarchs. And finally, the Church wielded an absolute monopoly over information. In an era when 99% of the population was illiterate, only the clergy could read and write. Monasteries served as the sole libraries, universities, and publishing houses where books were painstakingly copied. Priests were the only educators. This granted Rome total dominion over the minds of the populace. It didn't merely dictate what to believe. It shaped the very worldview, explained the past, interpreted the present, and foretold the future. Thus, the miracle of papal power was not the result of divine intervention, but rather the masterful creation of a nearly perfect system of total control, resting on 4 unwavering pillars: a unified legal code, a monopoly on information, colossal financial resources, and the masterful exploitation of humanity's primal fear of eternity. We speak of popes and kings, of papal bulls and church councils, but to truly grasp the monumental scale of this power, we must descend to ground level. Let's view it through the eyes of an ordinary person. Picture a peasant named Guillaume from 11th century Normandy. One day, driven by hunger, he killed a deer in his lord's forest. He was caught. Under secular laws, he faced the penalty of losing a hand or even death. But the local priest offered him a path to salvation for his soul, and perhaps his body, a penitential pilgrimage. And so, to atone for one single sin, Guillaume had to abandon his family, his small plot of land, and journey on foot to Rome. This was a journey of nearly 1,000 miles one way, traversing mountains and foreign lands teeming with brigands. It would take him almost a year. During this time, his family could starve, and his land could revert to his lord. And all this, just so a distant man in Rome, whom he had never seen, might grant him absolution. In the fate of this one peasant, in this walking marathon of desperation and hope, one can see reflected the entire real, tangible power of a system that permeated every individual's life down to the very last thread. But who ensured the operation of this colossal machine? Not the popes alone. Behind the glitter of tiaras and the grandeur of cathedrals always stood thousands of inconspicuous yet indispensable individuals. Among the chief, yet completely unsung, heroes of this era were the canonists, an army of faceless jurists and clerks who toiled in scriptoria and chancelleries across Europe, but especially in Rome. These were the true architects of papal power. While knights swung their swords and preachers appealed to souls, these individuals, in the quiet of their studies, by candlelight, hunched over parchment, forged the most formidable weapon of the Middle Ages, canon law. They collected, systematized, and commented upon thousands of papal decrees, council decisions, and the works of the Church Fathers, transforming this chaotic medley of texts into a coherent, consistent, and all-encompassing legal system. It was their meticulous labor that transformed the abstract idea of papal supremacy into a functioning mechanism. Every paragraph they meticulously penned with a quill, every legal case they dissected, became another brick in the edifice of theocracy. They determined which marriages were legitimate and which were not. They decided who would inherit a duke's estate. They formulated the rules by which a war could be declared just. Their work was largely invisible to the majority, yet it was precisely what created the legal reality in which everyone lived, from the emperor down to our peasant Guillaume. These nameless clerks were the true legionaries of Rome, conquering Europe not with the sword, but with the power of the paragraph and precedent. Another pivotal figure, without whom this spiritual empire would have crumbled under its own weight, was the papal financier. We've already touched upon the tithe and donations, but consider the logistical complexities. Millions of gold and silver coins, sacks of grain, and barrels of wine had to be gathered from every corner of the continent, from Scotland to Sicily, and safely transported to Rome. In an era of rugged terrain and incessant warfare, this was a truly titanic undertaking. This challenge was tackled not by priests, but by secular bankers, primarily from Italian cities like Siena, Florence, and Lombardy. They engineered Europe's first truly international financial network. They pioneered bills of exchange, essentially credit notes, that enabled the transfer of vast sums without the perilous task of transporting physical gold. These individuals became the very circulatory system of the Church. Their branches, dispersed across every major city, would receive tithes from the local bishop and in return provide him with a document that papal legates could redeem in Rome. They extended credit to the popes whenever funds were needed for war against an emperor or for the construction of a new cathedral. They managed the vast assets of the Holy See. These bankers, whose names rarely made it into church chronicles, were as crucial to the papacy's power as even the most influential cardinals. They inextricably linked Rome's spiritual claims with the material power of gold, without which those claims would have remained nothing but empty pronouncements. And now for a striking everyday detail that truly grounds this entire narrative, illustrating how intimately interwoven faith, politics, and the most mundane business truly were. We're talking about the relic trade. For medieval individuals, the relics of a saint were far more than mere commemorative objects. They were a physical conduit to the divine realm, a fount of miracles, protection from illnesses, and a guarantee of salvation. And securing them sparked a veritable bidding war. Cities and monasteries were willing to pay absolute fortunes to acquire an apostle's finger or a splinter from the true cross. This wasn't merely a matter of piety. Possessing a prestigious relic guaranteed an influx of pilgrims, and pilgrims meant money. It was medieval tourism in its purest, most direct form. This obsession spawned a gigantic black market. A veritable industry of forged relics flourished across Europe. Enterprising fraudsters sold the bones of common animals, passing them off as the relics of saints, while the sheer number of nails from the crucifixion or splinters from the cross circulating throughout Europe would have been sufficient to construct an entire fleet. John Calvin later sardonically calculated that if all known fragments of Christ's manger were gathered, they could fill a large stable to overflowing. This cynical enterprise, where the faith of millions became a commodity, coexisted seamlessly with official doctrine, and was often conducted with the tacit consent of church authorities, who were themselves major players in this very market. This illustrates that behind the facade of spirituality always lurked a profoundly pragmatic and earthly economy. By the end of the 13th century, the system of papal power seemed to have reached its absolute perfection. It appeared invincible, like a magnificent Gothic cathedral, complex, harmonious, and aspiring to eternity. Pope Boniface VIII, who ascended the throne in 1294, was the living embodiment of this supreme confidence. In his famous papal bull, Unam Sanctam, he articulated the doctrine of papal omnipotence with ultimate, almost defiant clarity. There are two swords, spiritual and temporal, and both are held by the Church. Secular rulers could wield their sword only with the Pope's permission and in his interests. Submission to the Roman pontiff, Boniface declared, was a necessary condition for salvation for every human being. This was the peak, the apogee. The system was operating at its very limit, and it seemed nothing could threaten it. Yet, it was at this precise moment that a perfect storm descended upon it. One that did not come from outside, but originated in the very heart of the Christian world. This storm was no reincarnation of Genghis Khan, nor another theological heresy. It was a new breed of monarch, Philip IV, the French king, famously known as Philip the Fair. Cold, calculating, and utterly ruthless, Philip was Europe's first truly modern ruler. He wasn't building a feudal kingdom, but rather a centralized state, complete with a powerful bureaucracy, unified taxation, and a professional army. And to achieve this, he needed what all empire builders perpetually crave: money. Vast, staggering sums of it. The primary source of wealth, untaxed and beyond royal control, was right under his very nose: the French Church. When Philip, desperate for funds for his war with England, imposed a tax on the clergy without Rome's permission, he did more than just violate an ancient privilege. He issued a direct challenge to the entire system of papal authority. The conflict erupted instantly. Boniface VIII responded as popes had for centuries. He threatened the king with excommunication, penned furious papal bulls, and reminded all who truly held sway in the Christian world. He followed a time-tested playbook that had unfailingly worked against German emperors. But he failed to account for one crucial fact: the world had changed. Instead of journeying to Rome in the sackcloth of a penitent sinner, Philip did the unthinkable. He launched a counterattack, and on the Pope's own turf, the battlefield of information warfare. His advisors, brilliant legists schooled in Roman rather than canon law, unleashed an unprecedented propaganda campaign across France. They accused Boniface of every mortal sin imaginable: heresy, the murder of his predecessor, sorcery, and even sodomy. For the first time in history, a secular ruler didn't merely debate the Pope, he publicly branded him a criminal, utterly unworthy of the Holy See. And this is where the system's vaunted cohesion, its very strength, proved to be its fatal vulnerability. For centuries, the papacy had rested upon the universal ideal of a unified Christian world, one that stood above all kingdoms. But Philip countered this universal ideal with a novel concept, one far more comprehensible and relatable to his subjects, the idea of the nation-state. He convened the first Estates General in French history, an assembly of representatives from all three estates, including commoners, and secured their full support in the struggle against the Pope's foreign interference. French bishops, barons, and merchants, faced with a choice between loyalty to a distant and arrogant pontiff and loyalty to their own king, chose the king. The weapon of excommunication, which had crushed emperors, proved powerless against a united nation. The climax of this drama became one of the most shocking events of the Middle Ages. In September of 1303, Philip's agents, led by his advisor Guillaume de Nogaret, stormed the papal palace in the small Italian town of Anagni. They found the 86-year-old Boniface alone, seated on his throne in full papal regalia. What happened next became known to history as the outrage of Anagni. Legend has it that one of the conspirators, Sciarra Colonna, slapped the Pope with a gauntleted hand. Whether that gesture was real or symbolic is beside the point. What matters is this: Christ's vicar on earth, a man considered inviolable, was humiliated, insulted, and arrested by common soldiers. The sacred awe that had enveloped the Pope's figure for 1,000 years evaporated in an instant. Boniface was freed by local residents 3 days later, but he couldn't bear the humiliation. Broken and ill, he died a month later. Yet it wasn't just an old pope who died. An entire era of boundless papal power perished with him. The victorious Philip didn't stop there. He engineered the election of his own protégé to the papal throne, the Frenchman Clement V, who, fearing a hostile Rome, moved his residence to the French city of Avignon in 1309. This marked the beginning of the so-called Avignon papacy, a nearly 70-year period during which the head of the Universal Church became, in essence, the French king's personal chaplain. A majestic system, one that had survived the fall of Rome, barbarian invasions, and the fury of emperors, didn't collapse under the blows of external enemies. It was crushed from within by the very force it had nurtured and cherished for centuries: strong monarchical power. The papacy had created kings, anointing them and granting them divine legitimacy, naively believing it could always control them. But what happens when the creation recognizes its own strength and decides it no longer needs its creator? Official history loves simple and clear narratives. Here's the medieval pope, there's the modern king, here's the universal church, there's the emerging nation-state. Their collision was inevitable. But such an interpretation, logical as it may seem, overlooks a far more cynical and captivating subtext to these events. There's another, more pragmatic theory that frames the conflict between Philip and Boniface not merely as a war of ideologies, but as a meticulously planned covert operation, the first act in a grand drama whose ultimate goal wasn't a vanquished pope, but something far more tangible: the treasures of the Knights Templar. According to this version, the attack on Boniface was merely a dress rehearsal, a test run before the main assault. To grasp this logic, one must appreciate the real scale of the economy at the time. By the early 14th century, the Church in France wasn't just a spiritual institution. It was a colossal state within a state, with a budget that, by some estimates, could even surpass the king's own. The Church owned nearly 1/3 of all cultivable land in the kingdom. It collected tithes, which were essentially a universal 10% tax on everything. And crucially, All these immense revenues were completely exempt from royal levies, flowing either to support local clergy or directly to Rome. Philip IV, perennially in need of funds for his endless wars, eyed this wealth draining from the country with barely concealed fury. For him, this wasn't merely an injustice, it was an existential threat to his project of building a strong, centralized state. In this financial cosmos, the Knights Templar held a truly unique position. They were more than just an army of monks. They were the world's first multinational corporation, boasting unimaginable wealth, their own army, a navy, and a network of branches, commanderies, across Europe. They served as the chief bankers and creditors to European monarchs, including Philip himself. And most crucially, legally, they answered to only one person on the planet, the Pope. No king could judge them, no bishop could command them. They were absolutely sovereign. Philip understood perfectly. As long as a pope as strong and unyielding as Boniface sat on the Holy See, reaching the Templars' riches would be impossible. First, the very institution of the papacy needed to be broken, discredited, and brought under his control. The primary guarantor of their immunity had to be eliminated. This is precisely why Philip's methods were so pivotal. He didn't merely defeat Boniface with force of arms, he subjected him to a public legal trial, albeit one conducted in absentia. He accused him not of political disagreements, but of heresy, the gravest crime by the standards of the era. It was a stroke of genius. He used the Church's own weapon against itself. He didn't reject the idea of judgment, he simply usurped the right to judge. His legists, these soldiers of law, essentially proclaimed a new principle. The king in his kingdom is the supreme judge, including in matters of faith. This was no longer just a dispute about taxes. It was a fundamental revolution in consciousness. Philip's actions carried a powerful hidden meaning. He wasn't simply challenging a specific pope, he was desacralizing the papal throne itself, transforming God's vicar into an ordinary defendant who could be accused, tried, and condemned by secular laws. The relocation of the papal seat to Avignon became not just a political victory, but a deeply symbolic act. Rome was the emblem of universality, eternity, and the Church's independence. Avignon, surrounded by French lands, became the emblem of its captivity and subjugation. It was akin to moving the United Nations headquarters to the territory of one of the world's superpowers. Popes transitioned from being Europe's supreme arbiters to high-ranking French officials, whose bulls and encyclicals were now penned with an eye toward Parisian interests. This change of residence was visual, tangible proof for all that the old world order had crumbled. Thus, this entire story unfolds before us not as a spontaneous outburst of emotion, but as a cold, multifaceted calculation. The goal, money and absolute power within France. The method, total war, waged on all fronts, legal, informational, and, as a last resort, physical. The first stage, neutralizing Boniface and subjugating the papacy. The second, which followed just a few years later, the destruction of the Knights Templar under the pretext of heresy and the confiscation of all their wealth. One would have been impossible without the other. Philip the Fair didn't just win an argument. He hacked the entire operating system of medieval Europe, rewriting its source code to his advantage. Boniface was freed by local residents 3 days later, but he couldn't bear the humiliation. Broken and ill, he died a month later. Yet it wasn't just an old pope who died. An entire era of boundless papal power perished with him. The victorious Philip didn't stop there. He engineered the election of his own protégé to the papal throne, the Frenchman Clement V, who, fearing a hostile Rome, moved his residence to the French city of Avignon in 1309. This marked the beginning of the so-called Avignon papacy, a nearly 70-year period during which the head of the Universal Church became, in essence, the French king's personal chaplain. A majestic system, one that had survived the fall of Rome, barbarian invasions, and the fury of emperors, didn't collapse under the blows of external enemies. It was crushed from within by the very force it had nurtured and cherished for centuries, strong monarchical power. The papacy had created kings, anointing them and granting them divine legitimacy, naively believing it could always control them. But what happens when the creation recognizes its own strength and decides it no longer needs its creator? Official history loves simple and clear narratives. Here's the medieval pope, there's the modern king. Here's the universal church, there's the emerging nation-state. Their collision was inevitable. But such an interpretation, logical as it may seem, overlooks a far more cynical and captivating subtext to these events. There's another, more pragmatic theory that frames the conflict between Philip and Boniface not merely as a war of ideologies, but as a meticulously planned covert operation, the first act in a grand drama whose ultimate goal wasn't a vanquished pope, but something far more tangible, the treasures of the Knights Templar. According to this version, the attack on Boniface was merely a dress rehearsal, a test run before the main assault. To grasp this logic, one must appreciate the real scale of the economy at the time. By the early 14th century, the church in France wasn't just a spiritual institution. It was a colossal state within a state, with a budget that, by some estimates, could even surpass the king's own. The church owned nearly 1/3 of all cultivable land in the kingdom. It collected tithes, which were essentially a universal 10% tax on everything. And crucially, all these immense revenues were completely exempt from royal levies, flowing either to support local clergy or directly to Rome. Philip IV, perennially in need of funds for his endless wars, eyed this wealth draining from the country with barely concealed fury. For him, this wasn't merely an injustice. It was an existential threat to his project of building a strong, centralized state. In this financial cosmos, the Knights Templar held a truly unique position. They were more than just an army of monks. They were the world's first multinational corporation, boasting unimaginable wealth, their own army, a navy, and a network of branches, commanderies across Europe. They served as the chief bankers and creditors to European monarchs, including Philip himself. And most crucially, legally, they answered to only one person on the planet, the Pope. No king could judge them, no bishop could command them. They were absolutely sovereign. Philip understood perfectly. As long as a pope as strong and unyielding as Boniface sat on the Holy See, reaching the Templars' riches would be impossible. First, the very institution of the papacy needed to be broken, discredited, and brought under his control. The primary guarantor of their immunity had to be eliminated. This is precisely why Philip's methods were so pivotal. He didn't merely defeat Boniface with force of arms. He subjected him to a public legal trial, albeit one conducted in absentia. He accused him not of political disagreements, but of heresy, the gravest crime by the standards of the era. It was a stroke of genius. He used the church's own weapon against itself. He didn't reject the idea of judgment. He simply usurped the right to judge. His legists, these soldiers of law, essentially proclaimed a new principle. The king in his kingdom is the supreme judge, including in matters of faith. This was no longer just a dispute about taxes. It was a fundamental revolution in consciousness. Philip's actions carried a powerful hidden meaning. He wasn't simply challenging a specific pope. He was desacralizing the papal throne itself, transforming God's vicar into an ordinary defendant who could be accused, tried, and condemned by secular laws. The relocation of the papal seat to Avignon became not just a political victory, but a deeply symbolic act. Rome was the emblem of universality, eternity, and the Church's independence. Avignon, surrounded by French lands, became the emblem of its captivity and subjugation. It was akin to moving the United Nations headquarters to the territory of one of the world's superpowers. Popes transitioned from being Europe's supreme arbiters to high-ranking French officials, whose bulls and encyclicals were now penned with an eye toward Parisian interests. This change of residence was visual, tangible proof for all that the old world order had crumbled. Thus, this entire story unfolds before us not as a spontaneous outburst of emotion, but as a cold, multifaceted calculation. The goal, money and absolute power within France. The method, total war, waged on all fronts, legal, informational, and, as a last resort, physical. The first stage, neutralizing Boniface and subjugating the papacy. The second, which followed just a few years later, the destruction of the Knights Templar under the pretext of heresy and the confiscation of all their wealth. One would have been impossible without the other. Philip the Fair didn't just win an argument. He hacked the entire operating system of medieval Europe, rewriting its source code to his advantage. And now, having observed all these seemingly disparate elements, the mosaic begins to coalesce into a single, breathtaking tapestry. We've seen the paradox of the forged donation of Constantine, the very bedrock of real power. We've delved into the world of the catacombs, where a flexible and resilient social network of faith was forged. We've traced how the audacious idea of St. Peter's legacy transformed into a mighty ideological doctrine. We've dissected the flawless engineering of this power, built upon law, fear, and a monopoly on information. Each of these threads is vital, but individually they fail to explain the core phenomenon, the almost 2,000-year endurance of this system. We've witnessed how, behind the curtains of history, invisible armies of canon lawyers and bankers toiled, weaving a legal and financial web that entangled all of Europe. And we've seen how this seemingly omnipotent system cracked and crumbled under the assault of a new, pragmatic world embodied by Philip the Fair. It is this moment of defeat and the subsequent humiliating captivity in Avignon that poses the ultimate question. If the system was so vulnerable, if it could be broken, subjugated, and forced to serve the interests of a single king, then why didn't it vanish? Why, after such a devastating blow, did it not splinter into hundreds of national churches? Instead, it managed to survive that. The Great Schism, the Reformation, revolutions, and 2 world wars, enduring to this very day. The riddle's solution lies neither in divine providence nor in a single stroke of genius. It resides in a fundamental principle embedded within the very foundation of this organization. The Vatican's secret lies in its unique ability to exist and operate simultaneously in 2 dimensions, in 2 seemingly non-overlapping realities. The first dimension is transcendent, spiritual. The papacy spoke not on behalf of kings or nations, it spoke on behalf of God. Its power rested not on the number of legions, but on the right to hold the keys to the kingdom of heaven. It trafficked in the most precious, most intangible, and most sought-after commodity in history, eternal salvation. This claim placed it outside the bounds of ordinary earthly politics. A pope might be weak, Rome might be sacked, but the idea that this very man in white served as the bridge between the earthly and heavenly realms remained an unshakable force, appealing not to reason, but to the deep-seated fear of death and the hope for eternal life. The second dimension, however, was utterly earthly, material, and often cynical. To protect and advance its transcendent ideal, the Church unhesitatingly employed the most effective and, at times, the dirtiest of worldly tools. Did it need a legal foundation for world domination? It forged brilliant fakes. Did it need to break an emperor's will? It masterfully incited his vassals' rebellions. Did it need money? It turned the forgiveness of sins into a commodity and built the most massive financial corporation in the world. Herein lies its brilliant and terrifying duality. The Vatican is a spiritual ideal embodied in the flesh and blood of a ruthless political machine. It was precisely this synthesis of the seemingly incompatible that became the guarantor of its survival. Spiritual authority granted the moral right to amass untold riches and political power. And wealth and power, in turn, allowed for the construction of grandiose cathedrals, the financing of crusades, the maintenance of universities, and the suppression of any heresy, thereby reinforcing spiritual authority. This was a perfectly closed, self-perpetuating system where the celestial justified the terrestrial, and the terrestrial served as a bedrock for the celestial. Any purely secular empire sooner or later crumbles under the blows of a stronger foe. Any purely spiritual doctrine risks remaining merely a beautiful idea in the books of philosophers. The Vatican, however, managed to unite both worlds. What, then, is the enigma of the Vatican's phenomenon? It wasn't merely a church. Its genius lay elsewhere. It understood that a perfect hybrid entity could be created, to take the eternal allure of religious faith and fuse it with the cold efficiency of an imperial bureaucracy. It offered solace to the grieving and absolution for sins, while simultaneously operating with the pragmatism and ruthlessness of a global hegemon. It was at once a mystical order, guardian of the secrets of existence, and a multinational corporation, masterfully managing its assets. This unique, historically unparalleled hybrid nature is its main secret, its philosopher's stone, which allowed it to adapt, mutate, and survive in any, even the most hostile conditions. And when you gaze upon this from the vantage point of 2,000 years of history, it simply takes your breath away. Great empires rose and fell, crumbling to dust. The Roman Empire, Charlemagne's Empire, Napoleon's Empire, the British Empire, all vanished from the world's political map. But this empire, whose borders stretched not across rivers and mountains, but deep within the minds and souls of billions, stood strong. It could not be conquered because its true territory was intangible. It could not be destroyed, for its foundations were rooted in eternity. This transcends pure politics or religion. It is a design of titanic, almost divine proportions. A blueprint for constructing an entire civilization, for forging a unified spiritual, cultural, and legal space designed to outlast any cataclysms. It was an endeavor to build a structure on earth as eternal and unchanging as the kingdom of heaven it represented. And the realization of this incredible ambition is far more awe-inspiring than any tales of secret archives and hidden treasures. The domino effect unleashed by this centuries-long struggle for power proved far more enduring and unpredictable than its participants could have ever imagined. The very concept of the modern state governed by the rule of law in which we live today is a distant, distorted echo of a medieval dispute between popes and emperors. It was in the crucible of this conflict that a concept revolutionary for its time was born, that two distinct powers, spiritual and secular, existed, and that a monarch's authority was not boundless. Philosophers and jurists, serving both sides, debated intensely for centuries, attempting to define the limits of these authorities. Where did Caesar's power end and God's begin? Could a king judge a bishop? Could a pope depose a king? The mere fact of this centuries-long debate slowly but surely ingrained a fundamental idea into the European consciousness, that there are spheres of human life, the realm of conscience, faith, and morality, into which the state has no right to intrude. This principle, born of a purely pragmatic struggle for influence, eventually secularized and mutated, transforming into the bedrock of modern liberalism, the concept of human rights and the separation of powers enshrined in constitutions around the world. The Vatican's legacy is woven into the very fabric of our daily lives, and we benefit from it without ever fully realizing its origins. Take, for example, our justice system. When you see a prosecutor presenting charges and a defense attorney representing the accused in court, you are witnessing a secularized version of a process honed in medieval ecclesiastical courts. It was canon law that first developed in Europe a complex procedure for formal investigation, witness interrogation, and rendering a verdict based on a legal code, not the rule of might. Even the darkest chapters of this history, such as the Inquisition trials, despite their undeniable brutality, contributed to the shaping of modern jurisprudence. Paradoxically, they set a precedent for formalized investigation, replacing far more barbaric trials by ordeal that relied on combat or hot irons. Or consider the university. This very institution, with its departments, its bachelor's and doctoral degrees, and its tradition of wearing robes at ceremonial events, it is a direct legacy of the medieval church. The first European universities, in Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, sprang from cathedral schools and were established under the direct patronage of popes, who saw them as factories for producing literate officials for their burgeoning bureaucracy. But there's a deeper, more philosophical imprint as well. The very concept of personhood, not merely a biological individual, but a unique being imbued with intrinsic value and dignity, entered our culture from Christian theology. Roman law only recognized persona as the bearer of legal rights, a mere mask. It was Christian thinkers, striving to comprehend the mystery of the Trinity, who infused this term with new, profound meaning, laying the groundwork for the entire modern concept of human rights. But the most astonishing aspect is the paradox of its legacy. The central idea, the greatest dream of the medieval papacy, was universalism. The creation of a unified Christian world, a Respublica Christiana, where national and ethnic differences would be secondary to a shared faith, and where all kings would be vassals of one spiritual father in Rome. All politics, all ideology, all crusades were aimed at realizing this grand utopian vision. Yet, the outcome proved precisely the opposite. It was the actions of the papacy, aimed at asserting its universal authority, that became the most potent catalyst for the birth of its fiercest foe, modern nationalism. When popes meddled in the internal affairs of kingdoms, imposed interdicts, and demanded money, they compelled monarchs to seek support from within their own nations. To counter Rome, kings had to rally their nations around themselves, appealing to a sense of common identity: French, English, German. Philip the Fair, by convoking the Estates General to secure the support of the entire French populace in his struggle against Boniface VIII, unwittingly opened Pandora's box. He pitted the sovereign will of the nation against the universal authority of the Pope. The Church envisioned Europe as a single family under its dominion, but its constant and often self-serving interference sparked a natural desire among the children of this family to break away and establish their own households. This process reached its zenith during the Reformation. Martin Luther's protest would not have been so successful had it not been for the support of the German princes, for whom breaking with Rome was not only a matter of faith, but also a brilliant opportunity to cast off papal control and seize vast ecclesiastical wealth. Ultimately, the dream of a unified spiritual empire morphed into its complete antithesis. Europe fractured into warring religious camps, and the universal church was superseded by national churches subservient to local rulers. Thus, the greatest political project in Western history, which sought to erase borders, ultimately became the primary cause of their definitive and bloody establishment. What relevance, you might ask, do these medieval power and faith disputes hold for us, people of the 21st century? The dramas played out in papal palaces and royal castles seem like exotic backdrops from a distant past. Yet, upon closer inspection, it becomes clear. The history of the Vatican is not merely an archival document. It is a perfectly functional model, an eternally relevant instruction manual on the exercise of power, which, consciously or not, the most powerful forces of our time are copying and replicating. We no longer fear excommunication, but we live in a world governed by new, secular Vaticans, gigantic multinational corporations, global media empires, and omnipresent digital platforms. Like the medieval church, they strive for universalism, blurring national borders and forging a single global space. Like the church, they possess colossal resources, often exceeding the budgets of entire nations. They create their own canon laws, user agreements and algorithms that regulate our lives far more effectively than state laws. They dictate which information is truth and which is heresy, worthy of deletion. They practice their own form of excommunication, cancelling or deplatforming, capable of instantly destroying a reputation and silencing a person, which in the digital world is tantamount to social death. And here, the central, non-trivial lesson of this centuries-old history crystallizes. The greatest danger lies not simply in power itself, nor in wealth. It lurks in the moment when any system, be it religious, political, or corporate, begins to claim not only strength, but also absolute moral rectitude. When an institution, created to serve a specific purpose, begins to consider itself that very purpose. The Vatican, at the zenith of its might, believed it was not just an organization, but the very embodiment of the kingdom of God on earth. And if that were true, then all its actions, even the most brutal and cynical, were justified by a higher purpose. This lesson is an eternal warning. The inquisitors who burned heretics at the stake did not see themselves as villains. Within their own frame of reference, they were surgeons, saving the entire body of the church from a gangrenous limb. They were saving souls from eternal damnation, and against the backdrop of this titanic task, the life of one stubborn heretic held no value. This terrifying mechanism of self-justification, where a noble goal legitimizes any means, repeats itself throughout history with disheartening regularity, from the Jacobin terror to the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century. Therefore, the history of the Vatican is not a condemnation of Christianity. It is a condemnation of any ideology that attempts to usurp the right to truth and places itself above criticism. It teaches us a healthy and eternal skepticism toward any authority that speaks to us in the language of dogma and demands not reflection but blind faith. It reminds us that the most reliable barrier against tyranny, both spiritual and secular, is the right to doubt, the right to ask uncomfortable questions, and the right to seek answers independently, even if powerful institutions dislike them. Ultimately, this entire grand and tragic saga, from St. Peter to the scandals of the 21st century, is a mirror reflecting the eternal human drama. It is a story of how even the purest and most luminous idea, once caught in the grinding gears of institutional power, inevitably grows an armor of laws, hierarchies, ambitions, and money. And this armor, intended to protect the idea, very often ends up suffocating it. To grasp the full depth of this clash, we need to perform an intellectual somersault and view the world through the eyes of the enemy, the Holy Roman Emperor. It's crucial to understand. In our eyes, he might appear to be a proud and stubborn monarch who defied the Holy Church. But in his own worldview, he was neither a tyrant nor a barbarian. He was God's anointed, the legitimate heir of Charlemagne and the Roman Caesars. His civilization was complex and ancient, built upon Germanic notions of loyalty to a leader and the Roman idea of imperial order. His truth was simple and, from his perspective, undeniable. God had established two orders on earth, the spiritual, headed by the Pope, and the secular, headed by the Emperor. The Pope was to pray for peace, and the Emperor was to fight for it. They were two pillars upon which the entire Christian world rested, partners, not master and servant. The central point of conflict, the investiture controversy, from the emperor's perspective, looked not like a usurpation of church power, but rather an act of state necessity and sacred duty. Bishops and abbots in his empire were not merely clergymen. They were the largest feudal lords, possessing cities, lands, and even their own armies. Appointing someone hostile to imperial authority to such a post meant creating a hotbed of separatism and chaos in his own backyard. For the emperor, the right to appoint bishops was tantamount to a modern president's right to appoint governors or key cabinet ministers. He wasn't usurping spiritual authority. He was ensuring the stability of his state by placing trustworthy individuals in key positions. He ensured that the church in his lands was strong, wealthy, and orderly, and thus served as a pillar of the throne. Now, imagine the cultural shock experienced by the imperial court when new, unheard-of demands arrived from Pope Gregory VII in Rome. For them, people of honor and tradition who had lived for centuries under the same laws, this was pure madness. Some Italian monk, previously unknown to anyone, suddenly declared a centuries-old custom a mortal sin and demanded that the most powerful ruler in Europe surrender his rights. In the eyes of the German barons and the emperor himself, this appeared to be an audacious attempt at usurpation of power, a betrayal of the divinely established order. The Pope, who was supposed to be a spiritual father, suddenly began to act like an aggressive politician, dictating terms through ultimatums. But the true shock, which shattered their worldview, was the very weapon the Pope wielded. The emperor's power was tangible, material. It was expressed in the number of castles, the gleam of his knight's steel, in thousands of acres of arable land. He was accustomed to fighting with sword and spear. But the Pope struck with something invisible, intangible, almost magical. A word. Excommunication, which freed vassals from their oath, was something wild and incomprehensible to them. It was like deploying biological warfare in the age of muskets. They couldn't fathom how one could lose a war without losing a single battle. How could a priest's word prove stronger than an oath of loyalty sealed with blood and honor? This was not merely a political conflict. It was a clash of two different realities, two distinct ways of thinking. And this is precisely where the tragedy of predictability became apparent. The emperor's strength, a feudal system built on the inviolability of the vassal's oath, became his Achilles' heel. The Pope didn't attack the top of the pyramid. He knocked the foundation out from under it. He pressed a button that transformed loyal vassals into rebels, shielded by a pious pretext. Rebellious princes, who had long dreamed of weakening central authority, received the perfect moral justification for their revolt. The emperor found himself trapped. He couldn't fight everyone at once, especially when his enemies were blessed by God's own representative. His reaction, while entirely consistent with his worldview, was utterly self-defeating. Faced with an insurrection triggered by a divine malediction, he sought to resolve the crisis through spiritual means, by imploring for absolution. His fateful journey to Canossa was not an act of cowardice, but a desperate gambit to restore a fractured order, to play by the very rules forced upon him. He believed that by enduring this humiliation, he would reclaim his legitimacy. But in truth, standing barefoot in the snow before the papal fortress, he publicly, for the entire world to witness, conceded that the authority of this priest superseded that of the emperor. Thus, a mighty and proud empire found itself utterly unprepared for an entirely novel form of warfare: ideological combat. Its very strengths, a devotion to tradition, an unwavering faith in the immutability of the established order, and a reliance on military might, transformed into its greatest vulnerability against a flexible, asymmetric, and utterly ruthless assault on the very foundations of its legitimacy. The emperor was like a majestic warship, suddenly ambushed by an unseen submarine, utterly unable to comprehend the origin of the torpedoes or how to mount a defense. The story of Gregory VII, known in his lay life as Hildebrand, is a classic Greek tragedy, that of a hero undone by his own greatest virtue. He was no cynical schemer like a Borgia, nor a cold, calculating jurist like Innocent III. Hildebrand was a monk, an ascetic, a man ablaze with the fire of genuine, unbridled faith. Throughout his life, he had witnessed sacred offices being bought and sold, episcopal sees falling into the hands of the unrighteous, and the Church, the very bride of Christ, humiliated and enslaved by secular rulers. His objective was crystal clear and, in its own way, noble: to liberate the Church, purge it of corruption, and restore it to its rightful place, above the temporal world, not beholden to it. But for the sake of this spiritual luminescence, he was prepared to plunge the world into darkness. His greatest moral compromise lay in this. To achieve his spiritual goal, he unhesitatingly wielded the most destructive political weapon available. He sanctioned and blessed civil war. The excommunication of Emperor Henry IV was far more than a mere spiritual punishment. In a feudal world cemented by fragile oaths of fealty, it was a fuse set to a powder keg. Gregory knew full well that by absolving the German princes from their oaths, he was not calling them to prayer and repentance. Instead, he was granting them legal and moral license to rebel. He was deliberately unleashing a bloody internecine conflict that would torment Germany for decades, inflict untold suffering upon common folk, and claim thousands of lives. And all of it in the name of the Church's purity. Herein lay his tragedy, a savior of souls transformed into a warmonger. He was convinced he was acting as a surgeon excising a cancerous tumor, but to an outside observer it appeared he was attempting to cure a headache with a guillotine. To truly grasp this transformation, we must peer into his very soul. Hildebrand was a man of absolutes. For him, the world was starkly black and white. On one side stood God and his church, on the other, the devil and his pawns, embodied by corrupt bishops and the emperor himself. In his universe, there was no room for compromise, no grey area of political reality. When he ascended to the papal throne, he brought with him this monastic, uncompromising spirit. Yet, the immense burden of power and the brutal intensity of the struggle began to change him. The solitude at the pinnacle, where every advisor could be a traitor and every messenger a spy, hardened him. Idealism gradually gave way to cold pragmatism. He still clung to his divine mission, but increasingly his actions were dictated not by the Gospels, but by political expediency. The famed scene at Canossa, often celebrated as the apogee of his triumph, was in fact the moment of his deepest moral descent. Before him stood not merely an adversary, but a penitent sinner, his spiritual son. He had an opportunity to demonstrate mercy, to reveal to the world the grandeur of Christian forgiveness. Yet Gregory chose not forgiveness, but humiliation. He compelled the most powerful man in Europe to stand barefoot in the snow for 3 days, transforming the sacred rite of penance into an act of public political flogging. In that pivotal moment, the monk Hildebrand definitively died, yielding his essence to the severe and merciless Supreme Pontiff Gregory. He revealed that his true interest lay not so much in Henry's spiritual salvation as in the sheer demonstration of his absolute power. It was a victory for the Pope, but a defeat for the Christian. The principal sacrifice offered on the altar of this grand objective was not a single comrade, but an entire people. Tens of thousands of German peasants, townspeople and knights who perished in the civil war that followed the excommunication were, to Gregory, merely an anonymous cast of extras in his grand drama of fighting for God's cause. They were the very collateral damage that is inevitable in any holy war. Historical accounts describe how entire regions of Germany were laid waste, how the armies of rebellious princes and the emperor alternately torched cities and villages. Yet from Rome, no words of compassion emanated. The Pope was too engrossed in his grand game of chess to notice the pawns being swept from the board. The irony of his fate was both cruel and inevitable. The political conflagration he ignited in Germany eventually reached him personally. Emperor Henry, having recovered from his humiliation, amassed a new army, invaded Italy, and captured Rome. Gregory was forced to flee under the protection of his allies, the Normans, who, in liberating him, subjected the Eternal City to a plundering it had not witnessed since the age of barbarian invasions. The great reformer, who had envisioned a strong and independent Rome, ended his days as an exile in a foreign city, leaving behind a burned capital and a fractured empire. His final words, which have become legend, perfectly encapsulate his entire tragedy. "I have loved righteousness and hated iniquity, therefore I die in exile." In them, there is not a trace of remorse, only a bitter certainty of his own rectitude. To the very end, he failed to comprehend that in his fervent hatred of iniquity, he himself had spawned an even greater iniquity. He battled the dragon of secular power so fiercely that he failed to notice he had himself become a dragon. His genius as a reformer constructed the edifice of the papal monarchy, which endured for centuries. But the cost of that construction was paid with his own soul and the blood of an entire generation. When we speak of the spread of Christianity, our imagination often conjures an idyllic vision, saintly missionaries arriving among savage barbarians, delivering impassioned sermons, and those, seeing the light, joyfully embracing the new faith. The reality was light years away from this harmonious narrative. The clash of two worlds, the fading Roman and the nascent barbarian, was not a peaceful synthesis, but a brutal and painful process, a true cultural war for survival. The first Christian missionaries who arrived in the lands of the Franks, Goths, or Anglo-Saxons did not build new temples. Instead, they systematically demolished ancient shrines. They felled the sacred oaks worshipped by the Germanic peoples, desecrated pagan altars, and shattered idols. This was no act of senseless vandalism. It was a calculated symbolic act, a stark demonstration of power. Look, I am destroying your God, and he cannot exact revenge. Therefore, my God reigns supreme. From the very beginning, the Church behaved not as a petitioner, but as a conqueror, one who came not to negotiate, but to impose its new order. This conflict unfolded not only on the level of sacred groves, but also on a profound psychological plane. The notions of good and evil, of valor and sin, held by a Roman Christian and a Germanic warrior, were diametrically opposed. For a German, the highest virtue was loyalty to the chieftain, vengeance for a slain kinsman, and a glorious death in battle, guaranteeing a place in Valhalla. Christianity, conversely, preached humility, absolute forgiveness, and love for one's enemies, concepts that, to a pagan warrior, sounded like a sermon of cowardice and weakness. In turn, for the Church, blood feud was a mortal sin, and ancestor worship, idolatry. This was a clash of two incompatible ethical codes, and it took the Church centuries, slowly, step by step, to rewire the minds of whole populations, replacing the warrior's code with the sinner's code, one requiring repentance. But with time, the Church understood that a strategy of total eradication of the old world was ineffective and prohibitively costly. And so, it employed a far more subtle and brilliant tactic. If an enemy cannot be defeated, it must be absorbed and digested. Thus began the birth of astonishing cultural hybrids. The most striking example is found in the holidays. The Church realized it was impossible to force people to abandon age-old, cherished rituals tied to the changing seasons. So, it employed a cunning tactic. The main pagan winter festival, the birthday of the unconquered sun, celebrated in late December, was not abolished, but reassigned to Christmas. Spring fertility festivals, with their rituals of life's awakening, were absorbed and reimagined and reinterpreted through the lens of Easter celebrations. Pagan in form, these festivities were infused with new Christian content. The Church, as it were, draped its own vestments over the old, familiar bodies of rituals, making the transition to the new faith less painful and more organic. Perhaps the most brilliant example of such cultural rebranding in history is the creation of the cult of saints. The pagan world was densely populated by thousands of gods, minor deities, and patron spirits. Every village, every profession, every family had its own celestial advocate. Christian monotheism, with its singular, distant, and abstract God, left an existential void in the soul of the common person. And the Church ingeniously filled it by creating a pantheon of saints. Saints became the Christian alternative to the old gods. Instead of Asclepius, the god of healing, one could now pray to Saint Panteleimon. Instead of Mercury, the patron of travelers, one could pray to Saint Christopher. The function remained the same, only the name changed. This allowed people to maintain their familiar model of personal relationships with higher powers, simply redirecting it into a Christian channel. How did all of this change the life of the average person? Let us again imagine our Germanic warrior, now baptized. His world had been turned upside down. Old habits were relegated to the past. Now he could no longer sacrifice a horse before battle. Instead, he had to pray and kiss the cross on the hilt of his sword. New, baffling prohibitions and duties emerged. For instance, fasting, a deliberate abstention from meat and pleasures, which for a person whose life was a struggle for survival seemed absurd. His time now flowed differently. The rhythm of his life was dictated not by the solar cycle and military campaigns, but by the church calendar, Sunday masses, fasts, and saints' days. The chime of the bell from the new monastery's tower became the primary tuning fork of his day, marking the hours for work and prayer. He was still a warrior, but now a new commander loomed over him, an invisible god whose orders were conveyed by the local priest and whose laws were far more complex and intricate than the simple code of honor of his ancestors. Ultimately, from this great melting pot, neither a Roman nor a Germanic entity emerged, but an entirely new, unique being, medieval European civilization. This was a whimsical, contradiction-filled hybrid, where Roman law coexisted with Germanic superstitions and gospel mercy with martial brutality. And the main chef in this gigantic historical kitchen, who decided which ingredients to mix and which to discard, was precisely the Church. It did not merely adapt to the new world. It actively constructed it, forging from the remnants of old empires and the wild energy of barbarian tribes the world we today call the West. The power of the papacy rested not solely on law, money, and fear. It rested on absolute control over the narrative, over history itself. The Vatican was not merely an administrative center. It was history's first global media conglomerate, which for centuries purposefully constructed its public image, utilizing every available technology, from manuscript copying to grandiose architecture. The greatest instrument of this myth-making, as we already know, was the donation of Constantine, a brilliant propaganda maneuver that created the illusion of legitimacy for centuries of claims. But this was merely the tip of the iceberg. Every hagiographical collection emerging from a monastic scriptorium was, in essence, a public relations text, crafting images of ideal saints whose lives served as exemplars of humility and submission to the Church. Every fresco on a cathedral wall, every stained glass window was a news story for the illiterate flock, vividly depicting what awaited sinners in hell and the bliss reserved for the righteous who remained loyal to the Holy See. Perhaps the most brilliant example of such cultural rebranding in history is the creation of the cult of saints. The pagan world was densely populated by thousands of gods, minor deities, and patron spirits. Every village, every profession, every family had its own celestial advocate. Christian monotheism, with its singular, distant, and abstract God, left an existential void in the soul of the common person. And the Church ingeniously filled it by creating a pantheon of saints. Saints became the Christian alternative to the old gods. Instead of Asclepius, the god of healing, one could now pray to Saint Pantaleimon. Instead of Mercury, the patron of travelers, one could pray to Saint Christopher. The function remained the same, only the name changed. This allowed people to maintain their familiar model of personal relationships with higher powers, simply redirecting it into a Christian channel. How did all of this change the life of the average person? Let us again imagine our Germanic warrior, now baptized. His world had been turned upside down. Old habits were relegated to the past. Now he could no longer sacrifice a horse before battle. Instead, he had to pray and kiss the cross on the hilt of his sword. New, baffling prohibitions and duties emerged. For instance, fasting, a deliberate abstention from meat and pleasures, which, for a person whose life was a struggle for survival, seemed absurd. His time now flowed differently. The rhythm of his life was dictated not by the solar cycle and military campaigns, but by the church calendar, Sunday masses, fasts, and saints' days. The chime of the bell from the new monastery's tower became the primary tuning fork of his day, marking the hours for work and prayer. He was still a warrior, but now a new commander loomed over him, an invisible god whose orders were conveyed by the local priest and whose laws were far more complex and intricate than the simple code of honor of his ancestors. Ultimately, from this great melting pot, neither a Roman nor a Germanic entity emerged, but an entirely new, unique being, medieval European civilization. This was a whimsical, contradiction-filled hybrid, where Roman law coexisted with Germanic superstitions and gospel mercy with martial brutality. And the main chef in this gigantic historical kitchen, who decided which ingredients to mix and which to discard, was precisely the Church. It did not merely adapt to the new world. It actively constructed it, forging from the remnants of old empires and the wild energy of barbarian tribes the world we today call the West. The power of the papacy rested not solely on law, money, and fear. It rested on absolute control over the narrative, over history itself. The Vatican was not merely an administrative center. It was history's first global media conglomerate, which for centuries purposefully constructed its public image, utilizing every available technology, from manuscript copying to grandiose architecture. The greatest instrument of this myth-making, as we already know, was the donation of Constantine, a brilliant propaganda maneuver that created the illusion of legitimacy for centuries of claims. But this was merely the tip of the iceberg. Every hagiographical collection emerging from a monastic scriptorium was, in essence, a public relations text, crafting images of ideal saints whose lives served as exemplars of humility and submission to the Church. Every fresco on a cathedral wall, every stained glass window was a news story for the illiterate flock, vividly depicting what awaited sinners in hell and the bliss reserved for the righteous who remained loyal to the Holy See. Unsurprisingly, such potent propaganda was met with fierce counter-propaganda from its adversaries. Emperors and kings who clashed with Rome commissioned their own legal scholars and theologians to pen treatises asserting that it was the Pope, not the monarchs, who had usurped power divinely bestowed upon rulers. Heretical movements crafted their own gospels and doctrines, portraying the Catholic Church as a corrupt and fallen institution. Yet, the most potent weapon of counter-propaganda was not treatises, but rather myths, acid-tongued, biting, and easily memorable tales that passed from mouth to mouth. The foremost of these myths, which endured for centuries and has reached our present day, was the image of the Pope as the Antichrist. Rome's adversaries, particularly during the Reformation era, pointed to prophecies from the Book of Revelation concerning the whore of Babylon, seated on 7 hills, seeing in this a direct reference to Rome. This idea transformed the Pope from the vicar of Christ into his chief antagonist, and the struggle against him into a holy war against the forces of evil. Perhaps the most notorious and pervasive story spawned by this information war was the legend of Pope Joan, a woman who supposedly ascended to the Holy See by deception in the 9th century. Nearly all modern historians concur that this tale is a fabrication, a satirical pamphlet that emerged several centuries later. Yet, for the medieval mind, such historical rigor was beside the point. The legend was simply too compelling to be false. It was an ideal instrument for discrediting. It struck at the very core of what they held sacred, the sanctity of the papal throne, the theological tenet that a woman could not hold priestly office, and the very idea of the pontiff's infallibility and divine election. If a woman could occupy the most sacred seat and, incredibly, deliver a child during a public procession, what sanctity or legitimacy could this entire institution possibly possess? This myth served as the ultimate medieval fake news story of incredible potency, one that inflicted immense damage upon the papacy's reputation and was actively exploited by all its adversaries for centuries to come. But as the saying goes, history is written by the victors. And nowhere is this adage more powerfully illustrated than in the official version of the Albigensian heresy's extermination. If you delve into the chronicles commissioned by the Church or the inquisitorial records, a chilling picture emerges. The Cathars, or Albigensians, are depicted as a sinister cult of dualists who revered evil. Allegedly, they believed the material world was the devil's creation, repudiated marriage to avoid proliferating prisons for souls, advocated ritualistic self-destruction, and posed a mortal threat to all of Christendom. From this perspective, the Albigensian Crusade, for all its undeniable brutality, was a necessary and righteous policing action, a holy war waged to excise the cancerous growth of heresy and save the souls of common folk from eternal damnation. The challenge, however, is that we know next to nothing about the Cathars from their own primary sources. The victors, the Crusaders and the Inquisitors, ensured their legacy was utterly annihilated. Their books were put to the torch, their strongholds razed, their leaders put to death. We are forced to see them almost entirely through the lens of their tormentors. It is akin to studying the history of a resistance movement solely through the records of an occupying regime. But even within these hostile sources, if one reads between the lines and in the findings of modern archaeology, a completely different picture comes into focus. Most likely, the Cathar heresy was less about theology and more about social dynamics. In the Languedoc region, one of Europe's wealthiest and most culturally advanced, an aristocracy flourished, distinguished by its liberal customs and the lyrical poetry of the troubadours. Meanwhile, the local Catholic Church was exceedingly wealthy, profoundly corrupt, and behaved more like a feudal overlord than a spiritual shepherd. Against this backdrop emerged the Cathar perfects, ascetics who embraced austere poverty, preached in the vernacular, and served as a living rebuke to the established clergy. They gained widespread popularity, not for advocating wickedness, but because they appeared to people as more authentic, more genuine Christians. Thus, the Crusade was less a holy war for the purity of faith than a cynical and brutal colonial conquest. Under the pious guise of combating heresy, barons from the impoverished and wild lands of northern France, with the Pope's blessing, descended upon the prosperous south to plunder and subjugate it. The official narrative, crafted by the victors, transformed the victims of aggression into dangerous criminals, and this war of conquest into a sacred crusade. This stands as a classic illustration of how control over history becomes the final and most decisive act of conquest. After the humiliating Avignon papacy, it seemed things couldn't possibly worsen. When, in 1377, Pope Gregory XI, swayed by the fervent pleas of St. Catherine of Siena, returned the See of St. Peter from France to Rome, a wave of fervent hope swept across the entire Christian world. It seemed this heralded the dawn of a great purification, a return to its foundational principles, an end to political machinations, and a revitalization of the Church's spiritual authority. But it was precisely at this pivotal moment, at the zenith of these aspirations, that a fatal decision was made, one that plunged the Catholic world into the most catastrophic and ignominious crisis in its entire history. This marked the second, and arguably most profound, point of no return, a juncture where the foundational concept of the Pope as the ultimate guarantor of faith's unity was irrevocably warped and utterly betrayed from within. The unraveling began in 1378, following the death of Gregory XI. The cardinals, convened in Rome for the conclave, found themselves under immense pressure. An enraged Roman mob, gripped by the fear that a Frenchman would be elected and the papacy would once again retreat to Avignon, besieged the Vatican, chanting vociferously, "We demand a Roman, or at the very least, an Italian." Amidst an atmosphere thick with fear and intimidation, the cardinals elected the Neapolitan Bartolomeo Prignano, who assumed the papal name Urban VI. They were, however, soon to regret their decision profoundly. Urban proved to be a harsh, quick-tempered and despotic reformer who immediately began to publicly insult the cardinals, issue grave threats, and strip them of their accustomed luxuries. It was then that the French cardinals, who constituted the majority, committed the unthinkable. They fled Rome, declared Urban's election null and void, asserting it had occurred under duress, and proceeded to elect their own rival pope, the Frenchman Robert of Geneva, who took the name Clement VII and promptly returned to Avignon. This pivotal moment marked the inception of the Great Western Schism. For the first time in its long history, the Church fractured not along doctrinal lines, but for purely political reasons. There was no dispute concerning the nature of the Trinity or the veneration of icons. Instead, the contention revolved entirely around who was the legitimate head of the corporate body. And this schism immediately cleaved former allies, even those who once shared the same convictions. On one side stood the idealists, the saints and the mystics, such as Catherine of Siena, who were utterly horrified. For them, what was unfolding was a catastrophe, the rending asunder of Christ's seamless garment. They appealed for repentance, for negotiation, for the preservation of unity at any cost. On the other side were the pragmatists, kings, princes, and the cardinals themselves. They perceived the schism not as a tragedy, but as a singular political opportunity. Europe was instantly transformed into a colossal auction of loyalties. England and the Holy Roman Empire, staunch adversaries of France, threw their support behind the Roman Pope. France, Scotland, and Naples, conversely, backed the Avignon pontiff. The choice of the true pontiff was now determined not by faith, but by geopolitical alliances. A truly symbolic act, one that signaled the ultimate betrayal of its foundational ideals, was the mutual excommunication. The Roman Pope anathematized the Avignon Pope and all his followers. The Avignon Pope, in turn, excommunicated the Roman Pope and all who supported him. The very vicars of Christ, entrusted to be shepherds of a single flock, publicly declared each other servants of the devil, condemned to eternal torment. For the ordinary believer, this was an apocalypse come to life. Whom could one trust? Whose sacraments were valid? Which of the two fathers held the true keys to heaven? The very bedrock of salvation, the Church itself, transformed into a source of profound doubt and paralyzing fear. In every diocese, in every monastery, two bishops or two abbots emerged, each cursing the other and fiercely vying for souls and revenue. Spiritual authority devolved into a brutal struggle for assets. The end ceased to justify the means became an end in themselves. The primary objective of each papal court, in both Rome and Avignon, was no longer the spiritual nourishment of the flock, but sheer survival and triumph in the political arena. And for that, money was desperately needed, enormous sums of money, to maintain lavish courts, to bribe allies, to wage wars. Both curias, competing with each other in their cynicism, pushed all the most corrupt financial practices to absurd extremes. The sale of church offices, unprecedented taxes on the clergy, and of course the widespread trade in indulgences, all flourished extravagantly. The machine designed for saving souls had finally transformed into a colossal pump for siphoning wealth out of Europe. The very idea of unity was sacrificed on the altar of ambition, serving a few dozen individuals adorned in red hats. This crisis of authority also ignited an intellectual rebellion. Witnessing two stubborn pontiffs utterly unable to compromise, Europe's brightest minds, such as the philosopher Jean Gerson from the University of Paris, put forth a revolutionary concept. They asserted that if the Pope, the head of the Church, had lost his mind or become a heretic, then the Church itself, represented by its bishops and theologians gathered in an ecumenical council, possessed the inherent right to judge and depose him. This doctrine, known as conciliarism, was an absolute bombshell for papal absolutism. It fundamentally argued that the supreme authority within the Church resided not in a single individual, but in the entire ecclesiastical people. This represented the first tentative sprout of ecclesiastical democracy, born from the sheer desperation spawned by papal tyranny. The schism persisted for nearly 40 years. At one point, there were even 3 popes simultaneously, and although the Council of Constance finally managed to depose all claimants and elect a unified pope, Martin V, in 1417, thereby defeating the conciliarist idea, the damage inflicted was irreparable. Unity was restored, but faith in the sacredness and infallibility of papal authority had been profoundly shattered. For an entire generation, Europe had witnessed that the Holy See was not a divine institution, but merely a political office, one that could and would be fiercely contended for using the dirtiest possible methods. The mystique had vanished. And it was precisely upon this scorched earth of doubt and cynicism, left in the wake of the Great Schism, that the seeds of Martin Luther's Reformation would sprout barely a century later. The betrayal of unity in the 14th century made the fragmentation of that very unity in the 16th century practically inevitable. When the Council of Constance in 1417 finally brought the Great Schism to an end and a single candidate, Martin V, ascended to the papal throne, a wave of palpable relief swept across Europe. It seemed the nightmare was over, unity was restored, and the Church was returning to normalcy. But this was merely an illusion. The society that emerged from this 40-year crisis was fundamentally altered. The true victors in this sordid conflict were neither the popes nor the councils. The real triumphs belonged to the secular rulers. The kings and princes of Europe had learned a crucial lesson. The papacy could and should be bargained with. They had witnessed how claimants to the See of St. Peter had humbly sought their support, offering in return political concessions and, more importantly, the right to control the revenues of the local church. Power that had for centuries flowed into Rome now began to remain in situ, filling royal treasuries. A new elite emerged, a national clergy whose careers were beholden less to the Pope than to their own monarch. The idea of a universal theocracy had perished. Upon its ruins, strong national states were being born, where the king became master not only of bodies, but in part of the souls of his subjects. Europe's economy, reeling from this upheaval, was rebuilt upon the bones of the old system. To finance their struggles, all 3 popes pushed fiscal oppression to its absolute limit. They introduced dozens of new taxes, selling not just offices, but even sacraments, transforming the church into a colossal money-gathering machine. After unity was restored, this system was not dismantled. On the contrary, it was refined and centralized. The new Pope Martin V and his successors inherited a Rome that had fallen into complete disrepair during the years of the papal court's absence and an empty treasury. To restore the Eternal City's grandeur and fund the ambitious projects of the Renaissance, the popes began to operate not as spiritual leaders, but as the most pragmatic financiers. Enormous flows of money, collected from across Europe, now went less towards charity and more towards the construction of opulent palaces, payments to renowned artists, and the maintenance of mercenary armies for waging wars in Italy. The centers of power on the world's economic map had shifted. The papacy, needing efficient management of its colossal yet chaotic finances, became dependent on new players, the great banking houses of Italy and Germany. The Medici in Florence and the Fuggers in Augsburg emerged as the unofficial treasurers of the Holy See. They oversaw the collection of tithes, extended enormous loans to the popes, and in return received lucrative contracts and monopolies. The papacy transformed from a shepherd of souls into the largest international debtor and investor, whose decisions were increasingly dictated not by theology, but by credit ratings. This cynical symbiosis of spiritual authority and immense capital sparked growing outrage, particularly in Northern Europe, which felt it was simply being plundered to finance Italian extravagance. But the most profound changes occurred not in politics or economics, but in the psychology of the people. The 40-year spectacle, during which the vicars of Christ cursed each other, declared each other heretics, and waged wars, inflicted a deep, collective trauma. The sacred aura surrounding the figure of the Pope was irretrievably lost. For the educated elites, this ushered in an era of utter cynicism. Yet for millions of ordinary believers, it was a source of existential dread. If even the head of the church could be a servant of the devil, as his adversaries claimed, then where could one seek salvation? This uncertainty and fear gave rise to a powerful movement that historians refer to as devotio moderna, or new devotion. Disillusioned with the official ecclesiastical hierarchy, people began to seek a personal, direct path to God, bypassing the corrupt intermediaries. Across Europe, mystical teachings flourished, secular brotherhoods emerged, and the book The Imitation of Christ by Thomas à Kempis, a veritable manual for cultivating an individual relationship with God, gained incredible popularity. People increasingly prayed not in churches, but at home, read the Bible, if they were literate, and sought holiness in daily life rather than in formal rituals. This explosion of personal religiosity was a quiet revolution, unfolding within the souls of millions. A society that had endured the shock of the schism desperately sought authentic faith, and it simply wasn't finding it in Rome. Thus, society, reeling from the upheaval, became a paradox. On one hand, an unprecedented wave of cynicism and pragmatism swept through the highest echelons of power. Renaissance popes behaved like Italian princes, prioritizing art, politics, and their own families over the salvation of souls. On the other hand, a colossal spiritual hunger, a thirst for reform and purity, ripened among the common people at the grassroots level. The unity re-established at Constance was merely superficial, a facade. Beneath the thin gilding of Renaissance splendor lay a deep chasm, dividing the corrupt elite from a flock yearning for renewal. Society survived, yet it was permanently infected by the virus of doubt regarding Rome's authority. The seeds of the storm, which would erupt 100 years later in Wittenberg, were sown precisely here, amidst the ruins of the Great Schism. Beyond the splendor and vices of the Renaissance papacy lay more than mere greed or debauchery. Behind them stood a new, powerful, and seductive philosophical concept that completely supplanted the medieval ascetic model. The driving idea behind it all was called Renovatio Romae, the renewal of Rome. Popes of the 15th and early 16th centuries ceased to view themselves solely as successors of Peter, the fisherman. They saw themselves as heirs of Caesar and Augustus. Their primary mission shifted from merely saving souls for the afterlife to building God's kingdom here on earth, in the form of a revived Roman Empire where the Pope would serve as both high priest and emperor. The Eternal City was once again to become the world's capital, but this time not just politically, but spiritually and culturally as well. This concept justified everything. The colossal expenditures for the construction of St. Peter's Basilica, the maintenance of the most lavish court in Europe, the patronage of great artists, and the waging of endless wars for Italian territories. These were not mere whims, but rather investments in grandeur, in the creation of a tangible material symbol of the Church's omnipotence. The intellectual engine driving this project was a constellation of brilliant humanists serving in the papal curia. These individuals, secretaries, librarians, diplomats, were the true grey eminences of the era. Schooled in the works of Cicero and Plato, they scorned the dark ages of medieval scholasticism and dreamed of reviving ancient valor and glory. It was they who provided the Renaissance popes with a new language and a new ideology. They transformed the Pope from an ascetic clad in sackcloth into a Roman emperor draped in a toga. In their treatises, the pontiff no longer appeared as a humble shepherd, but as the Pontifex Maximus, a great builder of bridges between earth and heaven, an enlightened monarch who, like Augustus, was destined to transform Rome from a city of brick into one of marble. This philosophy of power, which prioritized results over morality, found its most cynical and forthright expression in the works of Niccolo Machiavelli. He didn't invent this policy. He merely described and systematized what he witnessed around him at the court of Pope Alexander VI Borgia. Machiavellianism was not the cause, but the consequence, an ideal philosophical reflection of a new reality where the ends absolutely justified any means. But while this neo-pagan humanism, obsessed with power and aesthetics, flourished in Rome, a completely different philosophy was taking root and gaining momentum north of the Alps, becoming its absolute antithesis. This was Christian humanism, whose primary rallying cry was not Renovatio Romae, but Imitatio Christi, the imitation of Christ. Its proponents were also brilliant scholars of ancient languages and classical literature, but they used this new knowledge not to glorify earthly rulers, but to return to the origins, to the simple and pure teachings of the Gospels. They argued that over centuries, the Church had accumulated thousands of man-made laws, rituals and superstitions that completely obscured Christ's original message. Their goal was not to build a new Rome, but to purify souls by returning to the philosophy of Christ, a doctrine of love, mercy, and inner faith. The leading intellectual figure of this movement, its undisputed authority, was Erasmus of Rotterdam. He was Europe's most famous and respected scholar, a man whose opinions were sought by kings and popes alike. Yet, instead of serving their power, he directed the full force of his intellect towards criticizing it. In his best-selling work, The Praise of Folly, he acerbically and mercilessly ridiculed the ignorance of monks, the greed of bishops, and the warlike nature of popes, who, he claimed, more closely resembled Julius Caesar than the Apostle Peter. But his main weapon was not satire, it was scholarship. In the year 1516, he published a new translation of the New Testament from the original Greek, meticulously cleansed of centuries of errors, allowing every literate person to read and understand for themselves what Christ had truly taught. This work became an intellectual bombshell planted beneath the entire edifice of the medieval church hierarchy. Thus, at the dawn of the 16th century, Europe became the arena for a great battle of ideas, a dispute between two humanisms. On one side stood the Italian humanism of the papal court, elitist, aesthetic, obsessed with political power and classical form. On the other was the northern Christian humanism of Erasmus, ethical, appealing to the broader masses, seeking not power but moral renewal. One built cathedrals of marble, the other printed books that transformed the consciousness of millions. One glorified the Pope as Caesar, the other called for a return to Christ, the humble wanderer. This clash of ideas directly shaped real-world politics. The philosophy of Renovatio Romae demanded colossal sums from Pope Leo X for the completion of St. Peter's Basilica. To acquire these funds, he authorized the widespread sale of indulgences in Germany. And the philosophy of Christian humanism, disseminated throughout Germany thanks to the printing press, created an entire generation of people, including the young monk Martin Luther, who were intellectually prepared to see in this trade not just financial abuse, but a profound betrayal of the very essence of Christianity. The intellectual debate between these two philosophies was inevitably destined to escalate into a religious and political war. By the dawn of the 16th century, the system of the Renaissance papacy had reached its zenith. Rome, under Popes Julius II and Leo X, was more than just the capital of Christianity. It was the capital of the world, a vibrant hub of art, science, and power. Michelangelo was painting the Sistine Chapel, Raphael was creating his stanza, and the magnificent construction of the new St. Peter's Basilica was destined to stand as an eternal monument to the Church's might. The system seemed absolute, perfect, and everlasting. And it was precisely at this moment of its greatest triumph that it began to falter. The fatal blow came not from without, not from the armies of the Ottoman Sultan, nor from a conspiracy of kings. It came from within, an intellectual spark, struck by an unknown German monk in the obscure University of Wittenberg, landed on a powder keg of widespread discontent. And the system, blinded by its own grandeur, failed to perceive the threat. It was its own actions, the cynical sale of indulgences to finance its extravagance, that ignited the blaze in which it ultimately perished. The system's entropy began with arrogance. When news of Martin Luther's 95 Theses reached Rome, Pope Leo X dismissed it, calling it a drunken squabble among German monks. The system, accustomed to absolute obedience, reacted in its old, predictable way. It issued a papal bull threatening excommunication, dispatched legates, and demanded repentance. It acted like a gigantic, unwieldy mechanism attempting to crush a mosquito with a sledgehammer. But the world had changed. Thanks to the recently invented printing press, Luther's theses and his subsequent pamphlets spread across Germany in a matter of weeks. For the first time in history, the opposition had its own media empire, capable of competing with the monopoly of church sermons. When Luther publicly burned the papal bull in December of 1520, he wasn't merely incinerating a piece of parchment. He was burning the very aura of papal omnipotence. And the system, lacking immunity against such a viral spread of ideas, began to devour itself. Its rigidity, its inability to enact swift and flexible reforms, and its certainty in its own righteousness became its death sentence. Immediately, a fierce struggle for its legacy ensued. The grand vision of a universal Christian republic, which the papacy had built for centuries, was torn to shreds by greedy heirs, each interpreting it to their own advantage. The first heirs were the German princes. For them, Luther's teachings were not so much a theological revelation as a unique opportunity. By supporting the Reformation, they could achieve three objectives in one fell swoop: cast off Rome's political control, halt the massive outflow of money from their lands, and most importantly, confiscate vast and incredibly rich church properties. The dream of God's kingdom on earth was privatized and divided among dozens of secular principalities. But then other heirs emerged as well, the theological ones. Scarcely had Luther opened Pandora's box than dozens of other reformers burst forth, each asserting that they alone carried the true, uncorrupted faith. In Zurich, Ulrich Zwingli appeared, debating with Luther about the nature of the Eucharist. In Geneva, John Calvin reigned, establishing his austere theocratic republic. Radical Anabaptists emerged, rejecting all state authority and baptizing only adults. Christ's seamless robe was torn into 100 warring banners. The dream of returning to the purity of the Apostolic Church devolved into a bloody feud among the reformers themselves, who cursed and persecuted each other with no less ferocity than Rome had persecuted them. The grand idea splintered into a multitude of sectarian truths, each claiming absolute validity. The Catholic Church itself also stepped forward as an heir, but it was no longer the same indulgent, hedonistic structure. This was the Church of the Counter-Reformation, austere, mobilized, and militant. At the Council of Trent, it refused to compromise, instead reaffirming all its dogmas. The Jesuit order was founded, the Pope's special forces, an army of brilliantly educated and fanatically devoted intellectuals ready to reclaim lost ground at any cost. The old system didn't just die, it mutated into several new, irreconcilable and ideologically charged systems that plunged Europe into a century of devastating religious wars. The final tragic fragment of the Renaissance papacy's grand dream, the last chord of its demise, was the devastating sack of Rome in the year 1527. The irony of history was diabolical. The Eternal City was destroyed not by Turks or Lutherans, but by the army of the Church's most loyal son, Emperor Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire. His multinational troops, long unpaid, mutinied and stormed the defenseless city. What followed was a week of unspeakable terror. Palaces were plundered, churches desecrated, nuns raped, cardinals tortured for ransom. German mercenary landsknechts, many of whom were Lutherans, held drunken orgies in St. Peter's Basilica and performed parody masses, crowning a street prostitute with the papal tiara. These were the symbolic funeral rites of a grand dream. Rome, which was to have become the shining capital of a revived empire of spirit and art, was trampled under the boots of drunken soldiers. Renovatio Romae had culminated in its complete annihilation. Pope Clement VII, hidden in the Castel Sant'Angelo, watched helplessly as his world crumbled. After this blow, the papacy never truly recovered its former political might or its status as Europe's supreme arbiter. It survived, but as a shadow of its former self, merely the ruler of one of the Italian states. The great system did not die in the quiet of theological studies. It died in fire, blood, and the blasphemous laughter of mercenaries on the steps of Christendom's principal church. The era had ended. After the catastrophe of the Reformation and the sack of Rome, the great legacy of the Renaissance papacy, the dream of a Pope Caesar, a ruler of the world, did not simply die. It was cursed and nearly forgotten. For the next 3 centuries, during the age of absolutism and the Enlightenment, the papacy found itself in a state of permanent retreat. It ceased to be Europe's supreme arbiter and became just one among many Italian princes, often a pawn in the games of the great Catholic monarchies of France and Austria. Then came the French Revolution, which not only ignored the Pope, but declared war on religion itself, transforming cathedrals into temples of reason. Napoleon Bonaparte treated the pontiff as his personal chaplain, arresting him and confiscating church lands. By the 19th century, the age of nationalism and liberalism, the Roman Pope appeared to most European intellectuals and politicians as a living anachronism, picturesque but utterly helpless, a relic from the Dark Ages. When, in 1870, the troops of unified Italy entered Rome and stripped the Pope of his last vestiges of secular power, annexing the Papal States to the new kingdom, it seemed that history had finally run its course. The 1,000-year empire of the Spirit had ended, reduced to a museum exhibit. But it was precisely at this moment of complete, crushing, and seemingly definitive defeat that something incredible occurred. The legacy was not merely rediscovered, it was resuscitated and reassembled in a new, far more potent and unassailable form. The moment of rediscovery was the First Vatican Council, convened by Pope Pius IX, the very pontiff who had lost Rome. Right at the moment when Italian cannons were preparing to level the gates of the Eternal City, the Council Fathers, under the Pope's own pressure, adopted a dogma that changed everything. This was the dogma of papal infallibility. Its essence was revolutionary. When the Pope speaks ex cathedra, that is, as the supreme pastor, on matters of faith and morals, his judgments are infallible not by the consent of the Church, but by themselves, by divine right. It was a stroke of genius, an asymmetric counter-move. The very moment the Pope forfeited his final patch of earthly dominion, he declared himself an absolute, infallible monarch in the spiritual realm. Political power was exchanged for total doctrinal authority. This act laid the groundwork for the papacy's second birth. Stripped of his temporal kingdom, the Pope transformed from an Italian prince into something far greater, a transnational spiritual leader, the prisoner of the Vatican, whose moral authority only swelled from his visible weakness and suffering. Thus began the era of ultramontanism. Catholics worldwide, from Ireland to Poland, started looking beyond the mountains, ultramontes, to Rome as the sole center of resistance against a hostile secular world. And this is where new eras read old ideas in an entirely fresh light. Popes of the late 19th and 20th centuries did not attempt to resurrect the Renaissance monarchy with its armies, intrigues, and opulence. They extracted from the past the very concept of absolute centralized power, but infused it with entirely new meaning. Instead of battling kings for the right to appoint bishops, they forged a supremely powerful centralized bureaucracy, the Roman Curia, which established such total administrative control over the Catholic world that medieval popes could only dream of. Instead of constructing cathedrals, they began building a social doctrine. Pope Leo XIII, in his encyclical Rerum Novarum, acted as an arbiter not between kings, but between labor and capital, laying the foundations of Catholic social teaching on justice. The papacy transitioned from hard power to soft power. Its new weapons were not excommunications, but encyclicals, messages addressed not only to Catholics, but to all people of goodwill. Its new empire was not territory, but the global informational sphere. In the 20th century, amidst the horrors of world wars and the collapse of totalitarian ideologies, the voice of the Roman pontiff, speaking of peace, the dignity of the human person and human rights, became one of the most influential moral voices on the planet. He could no longer depose emperors, but he could inspire entire nations, as John Paul II did in his struggle against communism. Thus, a striking metamorphosis occurred. The Renaissance dream of a Pope-Emperor, forgotten for centuries, was resurrected not as a political project, but as a global moral and ideological center. Having lost dominion over one city, the papacy gained sway over the entire world. The political defeat of 1870 transformed into the greatest spiritual triumph and the most successful rebranding in history. The modern papacy we know today, with its diplomatic activity, global travels, and status as a moral authority, is not a direct heir to medieval theocracy, but its ingenious descendant, reassembled and adapted for a new world. It lost the battle for land to win the war for souls. Having journeyed through 20 centuries of intrigue, war, virtue, and vice, we come full circle. We began this story with the paradox of the donation of Constantine, a forged document that became the bedrock of real power. And now, in the 21st century, we discover that this problem has not merely vanished, it has mutated and reached planetary dimensions. Today, the struggle for power is once again a fight for legitimacy, rooted in a controlled narrative. But instead of a single parchment, the new architects of global power, states, corporations, ideological movements, wield far more potent weapons: global media, social networks, and algorithms capable of constructing truth in real time for billions of people. The medieval papacy sought a monopoly on the interpretation of a single sacred text. Today's power brokers strive for a monopoly on the interpretation of reality itself. They craft their own donations of Constantine, meticulously constructed historical myths, economic doctrines, and enemy narratives that justify their claim to power and wealth. And just as in the Middle Ages, dissent from this official narrative is declared not merely a differing opinion, but heresy, a dangerous form of heterodoxy subject to ridicule, marginalization, and ultimately, cancellation. The tools have changed, but the fundamental principle remains the same. Whoever controls the past and the present controls the future. And here, on the final turn of this spiral, we are confronted by the primary, irresolvable paradox of this entire 2,000-year history. Any grand idea, be it the salvation of the soul, the construction of a just society, or the attainment of a technological paradise, requires an organization, an institution, for its survival and dissemination. But any institution, to survive, needs hierarchy, discipline, resources, and power. And at some point, imperceptibly to itself, the institution created to serve an idea begins to serve itself. The armor forged to protect the soul becomes its prison. The pursuit of absolute spiritual order inevitably gives rise to the most pragmatic and, at times, the most brutal disorder. The dream of a kingdom not of this world compels the construction of the most powerful and effective kingdom of this world, complete with all its trappings: banks, spies, armies, and prisons. And in the relentless chase for this earthly power, deemed necessary to safeguard a heavenly ideal, the ideal itself is imperceptibly diluted, distorted, and ultimately betrayed. This is the eternal tragedy of Pygmalion. The creator falls so deeply in love with his creation, the magnificent edifice of the church, the party, or the corporation, that he forgets the very spark for which it was all brought into being. And this is not merely the story of the Vatican. This is the story of human civilization. Time and again, we erect magnificent cathedrals for our most brilliant ideas: democracy, freedom, progress. We construct intricate structures, laws, and hierarchies to shield them from chaos and barbarism. We believe that this time we will succeed, that our armor will serve only as protection, not as strangulation. And looking back at 2,000 years of this unfolding drama, at this endless cycle of birth, triumph, decay, and rebirth of one of history's most enduring systems, a fundamental, ultimate question emerges. Is this cycle fated, etched into the very nature of humanity and power? Are we condemned to forever construct magnificent golden cages for our purest impulses? Or does humanity, after all, have a chance to one day learn to preserve an idea without transforming it into an institution?